Hello, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Men's Quest. Today, we're going to discuss releasing grief. So, I've been thinking about grief a lot in the last week or so because I've been going to my men's circles, and the topic has come up. And I want to be clear: I'm not sharing what any other man has shared. I always honor their thing, but it was interesting because one man described experiences around releasing grief in terms of a ritual context, and I thought it was really interesting, and it made me think a lot about grief and how men hold on to grief a lot of times but don't know how to externalize it or express it. I remember with my dad that I rarely ever saw him cry. In fact, I remember the one time I saw him cry, I had taken him to the movie The Last Samurai, and we were watching the movie together. And in the scene where the samurai were charging the modern Japanese army and dying, that's when my dad started tearing up. And I looked at him surprised, and I'm like, "You're crying?" And he just kind of like brushed it aside. But this was from a man who told me that big boys don't cry and that men don't cry. So it was a very interesting experience for me to see that, because here he was crying, and it was obviously touching on something for him in that moment. In my own experiences with life, I learned early on I tried early on to hide my tears, to not cry, but I eventually learned to cry like a man. You'd say that, cry like a little boy. If you're crying, you're being a little boy or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, a man who can cry is a man who cries like a man, is a man who's owning his fear, his grief, the other emotions that may be coming up. And it's interesting because, when we tear up, it's not always because of grief or fear or sadness. Sometimes it's other things. I mean, I tear up when I feel moments of joy, because those feelings come in so intense and so powerful, and I just feel so touched. But nonetheless, in our lives, we have these experiences of grief, and they are part of us. And when we store grief up, it becomes a blockage within us. It becomes something that restricts our energy. It stops us from fully being able to be present, I think, in my experience at least. So one of the things over the years that I've done is I've learned that I learned, a few years ago when I started going through what I call a wintering phase in my life. I learned that I could not escape my grief. Part of my wintering was my dad's death. He died, and I grieved for not really getting to know him and not really having the opportunity to know this person in a meaningful way. It just struck me so deeply and profoundly, and it was so powerful that it just it took me by surprise on a deep, deep level. And it took me a long time to really get to a point where I could fully accept his death. I find that grief is really an embodiment of resistance. When we are in a stage of grief, we are resisting what we have not been able to fully let go and process. There's some part of us holding on to it, trying to keep it close, because we're not ready to fully accept it. And that's no judgment on anyone, because the fact of the matter is, we all have these experiences of grief. I mean, I had an experience of grief around like my ex-marriage. I was my ex-wife, grieving, for that relationship up until recently. When I finally got to the point where I really did release all of it, and I'm like, I've really and truly moved on. I wish this person the best, and I'm accepting that life has moved on, and I'm accepting that I am moving forward with my life in a very meaningful way, in a very rich and beautiful way. And holding on to this person any longer doesn't do me any good. It certainly doesn't do that person any good. There's nothing I can do to resolve that or anything. It's done. I can let it go. And that's really, I think, the important thing about releasing grief, is that releasing grief is allowing ourselves to not just express grief, not just feel sad, but actually being able to fully accept and process that we feel this sensation of grief, and that we can let it go, and we can move forward in our lives in a very meaningful and powerful and rich way. So when I release my grief, I'm releasing these experiences and feelings that otherwise have been holding me down. And I found this really to be fascinating and interesting to recognize this. So I started doing this last week. We were talking about releasing grief in each of my men's groups, and it was really good for me to share it. I was able to just share this grief that I'd been feeling around different things, around my self-employment ending years ago, around my dad's death, around the ending of my marriage, around other things. And as I did, I felt lighter and lighter because I was no longer holding on to it. I was letting it go, and I was having it honored in a space with these other men. And I think really that's kind of the key, that we can bottle our grief up inside of us if we want to. And some people will do that. But I think the more we hold on to it, the more it takes up the emotional and spiritual presence and place in our lives. Whereas if we can release it in some context, whether it's doing some kind of ritual or talking it over with people in a context where everyone is sharing, and we're allowing ourselves to fully share what it is that we're feeling, that is where we begin to fully step into our own power, because we discover our strengths as people. And for men, this is especially important because a lot of times we have been taught to not even cry. Oh, you're crying like a little boy, or don't cry. Only little boys cry. Big boys don't cry, or men don't cry. Well, you know what? Men do cry, and sometimes that crying is an expression of sadness and grief, and sometimes it's an expression of feeling touched and moved. Tears are not automatically sadness. I mean, that's something that's really important to remember, but they are all expressions and experiences. And these are things that we can open ourselves to doing. So share that with you today. And I would say that if you are holding on to grief, there are ways to release it, and it's better to not do it on your own. I think, finding people, like if you're a man, finding a group of other men to share with, men who will hold that space and honor the sharing, and can share their own grief, can be a very powerful experience, very releasing. And then you don't have to hold on to it. I know I feel lighter this week after having released the grief that I was feeling. It's just kind of like something switched for me. And so I feel more present and able to go forward and do this work. So that's it for this week's video. I just want to share that with you. And if you need help with any of this stuff, schedule a Sacred Masculine Strategy session with me, or check out my e-booklet, The Men's Quest, which you can find below this video. And otherwise, have a wonderful, wonderful day.